Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 5th Metzstein Discourse. This is a bit of a historical occasion for the discourse to be introduced by myself. I'm Joyce Cairns. I'm the recently elected president of the first female president of the Royal Scottish Academy in 192 years. Therefore, it is only fitting that this year we should also welcome the first female architects, Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara from Grafton Architects in Dublin, to present the 2019 discourse. At least they only had 5 years to wait to be invited, which is indeed progress for the Academy. The annual Metzstein Discourse was the original idea of Richard Murphy, RSA, and inaugurated by the Royal Scottish Academy in memory of Professor Izzy Metzstein, RSA. He was a remarkable architect and teacher, and a conversationalist and a huge supporter and a former treasurer of the Academy. Izzy, along with his partner, Professor Andy Macmillan, RSA, worked in the Glasgow practice of Gillespie, Kidd and Coya, and between them they've left some influential and remarkable buildings. In his role as a teacher and a critic, he inspired a whole generation of architectural students and students at the Macintosh in Glasgow and Edinburgh University Schools of Architecture and elsewhere. His insights, scrutiny, sense of humour, acerbic wit touched all of us, and he is still very much missed in the Academy. Izzy was no shrinking violet, and here I quote Professor Robin Webster: "No new building or design could escape unscathed, no matter how eminent its author, without some enlightening comment, insightful criticism, or barbed dismissal." I want to extend a special welcome tonight to his wife Danny, son Saul, and daughter Ruth, who are also here, and thank them for their continued support. Previously, we have been honoured to host 4 eminent speakers: Alvaro Siza, Glenn Murcutt, Peter Zumthor, and Sir David Chipperfield. And I'm delighted now to hand you over to Neil Gillespie, RSA, OBE, from the architectural practice of Riach and Hall, who will introduce Yvonne and Shelley. Thank you.
Okay, here we go. Good evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara of Grafton Architects. Architecture is a difficult thing. Each year it seems more and more complex, more demanding. A young architect, or an old architect, not only has to have significant design skills, they need to be politicians, they need to be accountants, social workers, they need advanced computer skills, they need to be patient, empathetic, and yet decisive and confident. The architect has to balance, synthesize, and then act. O.F. Bolnose states, when someone leaves his house, he cannot move as he wishes in the terrain, but is bound to certain predetermined possibilities. The terrain as such offers an impediment to move forward in space. One has to see how to advance most advantageously within it. The RSA Metzstein Discourse offers us the possibility of discovering, or at least eavesdropping in, on how the world's finest architects navigate and traverse a contemporary culture and political terrain that is fraught with challenges and indifference. Grafton Architects navigate this difficult territory with modesty and humour, as one of those most respected and significant architects working anywhere today. I will not read out a full CV, that would take too long. We have a small publication which attempts to summarise that. However, you're not going to get off that lightly. I'm going to go through some of it. Grafton Architects were founded in 1978. Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara work alongside co-directors Gerard Carty and Philippe O'Sullivan. Yvonne and Shelley were both graduates of the School of Architecture, University Dublin. They are Fellows of the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland. They are International Fellows of the RIBA. And I'll get this word wrong, but you can help me. They are elected members of the Eistona, the eminent Irish arts organisation which honours artists whose work has made an outstanding contribution to the creative arts in Ireland. Teaching is central to their architectural practice. They've both taught at the School of Architecture, University Dublin from 1976 to 2002, and they were subsequently appointed adjunct professors in 2015. This is very nervous when they're checking this as they go. They have been full professors of the Accademia de Architectura Mendrisio since 2013, having been visiting professors from 2008 to 2010, visiting professors at EPFL Lausanne from 2010 to 2011. They have held the Kenzo Tanji Chair at Harvard Graduate School of Design in 2010 and the Louis Kahn Chair at Yale in 2011. Yvonne and Shelley were appointed curators of the 16th Venice Biennale International Architecture Exhibition 2018 under the title Free Space. That's why we couldn't get them for October last year, but we managed to lure them over this year. They have having had a long association with the Venice Biennale, having shown as part of the Italian Pavilion 2002, they exhibited as part of the Irish group The Lives of Spaces 2010, they won the coveted Silver Lion Award in 2012, and they presented the Physics of Culture in 2016. Well, awards. They've won many awards, as you could imagine, from the RIAI, the Irish Design Institute, Civic Trust, Architectural Association of Ireland, and also won numerous international awards. A few of these awards and honours. We'll soon get through it. Yvonne and Shelley were appointed Cultural Ambassadors for Ireland by the Minister of Culture and Heritage in 2019. In 2018, they were awarded the RIAI Triennial Gold Medal for Architecture for the University of Luigi Bocconi in Milan. In 2018, they won the Ulysses Medal from the University College Dublin. They were the University of Virginia and Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello Architecture Medalists in 2017. Didn't think I'd get that one out. The RIBA International Prize 2016 for the new campus for UTEC, University of Engineering and Technology in Lima. They won the Irish Design Institute Award for Outstanding Achievement for Design in Ireland. In 2015, they were awarded the Jane Drew Prize. In 2015, they were awarded the University College Dublin Foundation Day Medal. And in 2013, the RIBA European Award for the University of Limerick. In 2012, at the 12th International Venice Biennale, they won the Silver Lion for Architecture as New Geography. Remember that. In 2009, the Architectural Association of Ireland, Downs Medal. 2009, Mies van der Rohe Award. 2008, the World Architecture Festival for the World Building of the Year for the University Luigi Bocconi in Milan. In 2003, they won the Architectural Association of Ireland Downs Medal again. That's a brief synopsis of their CV. They are the subject of a major and comprehensive monograph by Robert MacArthur for the Phaidon Press. How far am I? Right. Last page. The work that is currently on the boards or on site will see a series of major buildings realised that, in my opinion, will transcend even the heights that they currently occupy. I've got 6 here, but I know there's more. The School of Economics for the University of Toulouse, head offices for the Electricity Supply Board with O'Mahony Pike Architects, the Institute Mines Telecom in Paris, townhouse building for Kingston University, the Parnell Square Cultural Quarter project in Dublin, and the Marshall Building for the London School of Economics. In this short introduction, I will cite only one completed building, the new campus for UTEC, the University of Engineering and Technology Lima, Peru, as a measure of Grafton's courage and skill. This is where I go a wee bit off piste here. The great Scottish poet, essayist, and thinker Kenneth White talks of the Atlantic edge. He talks of connections and systems that are geographic in scale and scope. And it was him that coined the phrase geopoetics. Well, this is me. The Gulf Stream knows nothing of politics or borders. Wild geese cross borders with impunity, oblivious to the machinations and jealousies of man. Architecture, too, knows no boundaries. Great work is just that, great work. Great work transcends time, ancient, modern, domestic, commercial, male, female, young, old. And the Atlantic edges of the old world and the new world, Europe and the Americas, sit in opposition to one another. And we were privileged to have the great Alvaro Siza give the inaugural RSA Metzstein Discourse in 2014. And his talk centered on the remarkable Iber Camargo Foundation in Porto Alegre in Brazil. Siza connected the old and new worlds in this masterpiece. He crossed the Atlantic, borne by the experience of Porto and Portugal, to realize a project that was of Brazil. Grafton Architects, their work and thinking, embedded in and stemming from an intimate passion and understanding of the city of Dublin, crossed the Atlantic too, to create something equally as astonishing, and of that place, Utrecht and Lima, a daring concrete cliff-like structure of open terraces and walkways, an architecture as geography, to use their term. Grafton themselves have stated, a building that rises to the level of discourse is one that makes you hesitate in everyday life and for a moment at least consider the potential of living in a better society. I think we're about to experience one of those moments. Ladies and gentlemen, Shelley McNamara and Yvonne Farrell of Grafton Architects.
First of all, I'd like to say that the two people who introduced us, after 192 years, Joyce Cairns, President of the Academy, and Neil Gillespie, it's really humbling when you hear the kind of litany of description, so thank you for your kind words. We'd like to thank all those who are involved. Besides Neil, there's Colin Greenslade, Director of the RSA, and Matt Hill for greeting us so kindly this morning in the airport and getting us here safely. It is truly a great pleasure. I'd like to begin by saying that architecture impacts on us all, practitioners, students of architecture, every member of the general public. And this evening, we'd like to share with you things that we ourselves have learned, things that we have discovered through making some of our projects. All of our projects, big and small, have meaning. And we'd like to share with you, both students of architecture and practitioners, we want to share with you things that we're becoming more aware of. We have discovered that light dissolves structure. We've discovered that light bounces and is delightful. It goes down 5 meters below ground. It can actually go down 9 meters below ground. Since 2008, more than half the population of the world live in cities. And as the years pass, that proportion will increase. And as Neil has referred to, we do believe that architecture now has become the new geography, impacting on all our lives more than we actually realize. That architecture is not a collection of buildings, it is a container of lives. We have discovered also the serious business of sustainability is not just layering additional things and additional elements on buildings, but is an integral part of culture. In fact, architecture is the physics of culture. As curators of the Venice Biennale, researching the impact of building around the world, we have discovered that they are what we call architectural warriors all over the world. And these people are making good and meaningful work. They're not the stars, but they are contributing to a firmament of built environment. Neil referred to the Biennale, and when we were asked to be curators of the Biennale, we had to develop a manifesto, which was really to list out our values. And we decided on the term free space for a number of reasons. Really, we wanted to have the word space in anything to do with architecture, because architecture is not about object, it is about space, the space in which we stand as humans. And we wanted to use the word free because we wanted to talk about generosity, that architecture is an amazing profession. It works from the generosity of our profession, giving something that hadn't been dreamed of before. It is now clear, I suppose, also from the work of, say, somebody like Jørgen Utzon, the amazing Danish architect, who can make a building in Sydney, Australia, an opera house on the edge of the water, which has become the emblem not only of a country but of a continent. And at the same time, that same architect can make, in the doorway of a house called Can Lis in Mallorca, a piece, a threshold, a seat made of concrete and tiles, two cold materials. But by virtue of his skill, knowing the human body, he can make a piece of concrete feel like satin, like a piece of silk beneath the human body. He can tilt the back of this seat with its cold tiles into something that supports your back. So the span of the architectural ability to make an emblem and a symbol of a nation, to hold the human body, that is the span of architecture. The other issue of free space for us was referring to a wonderful saying, we've often quoted it, by the Spanish architect Alejandro de la Sota. And he says that architects should make as much nothing as possible. What's really interesting about that is the nothing in which we stand. It is now clear that everything affects everything else. What we do as architects impacts on the materials of the earth. It affects climate. It affects the health and well-being of us all. When we specify materials as architects, we redistribute the natural resources. One of the most important natural resources we have is intelligence. The Swiss architect, Annette Spiro, said in a lecture called 7 Forms of Economy, and I quote her, "You can economize on anything you like in architecture, but don't do it in your thinking." End of quote. We think that Izzy Metzstein, who was one of our teachers and whom we are honoring this evening, would agree with Annette Spiro's statement. You can economize on anything you like in architecture, but don't do it in your thinking. Just change the slide. Architecture is a collective endeavor. We would like to acknowledge tonight all our team in Grafton Architects, all our people who are highly skilled, creative, hardworking, whose dedication and intelligence makes projects possible. Collaboration is the nature of civil society. Cities themselves are the built evidence of collaboration. And we had a wonderful day here in Edinburgh, being brought around by someone like Neil, whose passion for the city is palpable, just to see what an incredible resource Edinburgh itself is, between the castle and Holyrood, the mile, the buildings, that every building represents an era, is a statement to the, if you like, the power of built heritage. We begin here with a project in Dublin. We live in this city. This is a typical street. When we were researching Georgian buildings, you realize that between 50 and 80% of the surface is solid. It is punctuated by windows. It is a sheer wall built because of the leasing structure of Dublin. It has this variety, it has sameness, but has change. And we were building a project between Merrion Square, which is here, and St. Stephen's Green. It was for the Department of Finance. What was really interesting about this site for us was that in the section here, it was beside the Huguenot Cemetery. And the Huguenots were amazing refugees who came to various cities around, especially around Europe, but they came to Dublin. And they were amazing in terms of their industry and their commitment to city. And this little place, this Huguenot Cemetery, which is just about to have the bluebells come into bloom, is a protected space in the city. and we were asked to build offices for the Department of Finance. And originally they didn't want a door onto the street, and we felt, because it was connecting onto government buildings, we felt it would be terrible to have a building on a street without a door. It would be like a face without a mouth, without a structure. So we worked with the department and made a door to the city, but the other working arrangement was with the Huguenot Trust, and the previous building that had been there had a blank facade facing onto the Huguenot Cemetery. And working with the Huguenot Trust, they allowed us to make windows facing onto the cemetery, which meant that we could have light. What's unusual about this city building is that we have light from the south, from the east, the north, and the west over the Huguenot Cemetery. And the only thing that they asked us to incorporate was that in the Huguenot Cemetery there's a wall at the back of the cemetery, which is here in the drawing, which is made of calc, which is a stone not used anymore in Dublin, but a very brittle, dark black stone. And what we did then was that the wall that we made between our new building and theirs, that we used, it's a limestone from Kilkenny in Ireland, and we flamed it, so that meant that it brought up, when it rains, it goes really black. So really this is saying, this is a building onto a street in Dublin. It has light on all sides, as I've said, but also that it has nothing in the brief which can be shared. So what we did, there was nothing other than offices. So we took the staircase, and we made the staircase as the, if you like, the element that protects the offices from the street. We chose a Ballinasloe limestone, a lighter limestone here, which are in huge planks, which are 100 millimeters thick and vary between 900 and longer in terms of planks. And we made this building, which has a Georgian area of 3 meters separating it from the threshold, from the street to the entry, with American bronze filigree gate. And what's really things that we've learned that we'd like to share with the younger architects who are training, that this line here, which is 20 millimeters, which is tiny, is incredible in the shadow of facing south. So this was if you like, a 20 millimeter distance, which articulates the various banding of stone in this building. This is a project in 2002. We were invited with as a part of 10 architectural practices around Europe to enter a competition for Bocconi University. Bocconi is like the Harvard of Italy, a university embedded in a city that was very badly bombed in the Second World War, and this competition was amazing. We were an architectural practice in Dublin, about 8 architects at the time. This was a project that was enormous in the scale of building. It was between 45,000 and 65,000 square meters of area. They wanted 1,000 offices for professors and for academic staff. They wanted a big hall for 1,000 people, and they wanted about 5 big seminar rooms for about 250 people. And this incredible drawing that Shelley made to summarize the organization is really saying, if we have 1,000 offices, what would happen if we make them like an abacus and we lift them up into the ceiling, that we allow them to be, if you like, the world of offices with courtyards. And the other thing is that instead of putting all the big rooms, which was asked for in the brief, tucked down into the underground, that they came up like an eruption, like a corruption of the land, to bring light down. So this drawing is describing the pieces which were to be underground, reaching up to the light and the light coming down. So this, what is really interesting, I suppose, in the detailing or in the working of architecture, that a sketch, which is a tiny thing, can become the kind of acorn, can hold the whole thesis of the project together. So in this sketch, it really holds the 1,000 offices up above, courtyards that allow the sunlight in, and the corrupted groundscape. What is really important here on the right-hand side is an image of a wonderful project that I've never seen, but Shelley has, in South America, by the Italian architect who moved there, Lino Bobardi. And this structure is enormous, spanning over a public space in this image. So when we were working on this project for the competition. This is a cardboard model, which is about this size at 1:500, to give courage to students who probably are really worried about whether they're making bad models or not. The fantastic thing about a bad model even, or a crude cardboard one, is that it begins to set up the, if you like, the rhythm of the project. So here is the site, 180 meters long, divided into every 3.5 meters. These twin structures hold the abacus of the offices on the upper level, and the offices, which are standard offices, sometimes single corridor, sometimes double, and they're pushed apart like an abacus to let the light down. So this is the aspiration of the competition, where the soffit of the hanging offices would allow this new world between the city and the campus, between the offices hanging above and carving into the earth. And this is also a very simple 1:500 paper model, which is describing how we wanted to carve into the earth of Milan, and to bring courtyards down, to bring the light down. And this plan, which is really describing what Shelley and I discovered when we were doing the competition, is that Milan is full of these incredibly beautiful stone carpets, really, in the city. And you get this, so this is our project, about 80 or 50, between 50 and 80 meters here, 180 long, and that the Great Hall would be placed at the junction between the city and the side street that you would move diagonally through to connect into the campus itself, and that you would arrive in plan, you would arrive at this level and drop down 5 meters here, so you could have the foyer dropped, relating to the city, but not sitting on this busy thoroughfare, and that we put the big hall for 1,000 people, cocooned from the noisy, this is the noisy street, not only with cars, but also with trams. So in terms of structuring space, these are the diaphragm walls, which are every 25 meters, 3.6, 25 meters, 3.6, and each of these, if you like, marches down the site from north to south, allowing us then to place the structure on top of this. So this is a structural diagram which shows the beams then, that these were built first, the beams are placed in position, and from those beams the offices are hung. And that allowed us then to have these soffits that could be low or high, depending on how we wanted to make the space below. We want to discuss this because what we have learned is that each project feeds the next project. This was a small project that we had just finished in University College Dublin. It's the Urban Institute. And the reason for showing you here tonight is that this was a little tiny building in the university, made by concrete blocks, probably the humblest and most modest of materials. So the structure is a concrete block with so the north-south plan here, so these piers are made of concrete block. Across them then we have a grid of light, which is like a tartan. I'm very aware when I use the word tartan grid that I'm in Scotland. That the tartan grid of the structure in one direction and light in another, we discovered that it was absolutely beautiful in terms of the way light could be could dance. And another project that we had just finished a number of years before in Dublin, a tiny slot of space off Merrion Square. It was a little cinema and offices and living, but the interesting thing about it was facing north into a rather, not a very good vista. So this project developed clear glass, white glass, layered planks to protect the spaces inside in terms of the view, but also to capture light in a different way. And what was very useful then, that years later, when we were building Bocconi and making those courtyards, we needed, if you like, a strategy to protect the professors across the courtyards, the hung courtyards in the sky. So in the same way as Denzil Lane had these layers of glass, the same was through, this is a long section through Bocconi, the street level, the level down below, the technical level, 2 levels of parking, and the courtyards with these 3.6 diaphragm walls, which are circulation. So what you're reading in this long section are really these, they were like shingles, glass shingles. We worked with Permastelisa to develop a way of hanging the glass so that these are hung on little kind of glass holding buttons, and they hang like shards of light to protect the professors across the courtyard. And we wanted to show you this, if you like a working drawing or a very modest drawing in terms of the project. Here you have the street level of the city of Milan coming in on grade. Here you have the beams. Up here are the structural beams from which are hung the offices on metal ties. And here are the soffits of the offices above. You arrive and you can drop down -5, -9, technical and car parking down below here. So the section, we use the term that the plan is, if you like, the functional relation of elements, but that the section is the emotional component. It's the place where you have volume, it's the place where you have light, it's the vertical container. And what was really interesting is for us is that when we moved during the competition, we had the hall at one stage further down in the plan, very silent, and the building was really just like a very nice office block. And when we moved in the design process, we moved the aula to this position. It meant that this was, if you like, speaking to the city of Milan. And we use the term sometimes that architecture is the silent language that speaks. It is mute, but it conveys. And what's interesting from the university's point of view is when we won this competition, it was also that they felt that their new building was connecting the new university building to the city of Milan. And when in the beginning of our talk this evening, we talked about, to make as much nothing as possible, to talk about free space, to talk about the void, that the space, this is the city of Milan on grade, this is 5 meters down, and hovering overhead, 22-meter cantilever, which is the projection of the upper part of the Great Hall, the Aula Magna. And for us, I mean, this is a project that opened in 2008, but for all of us, when we go to Milan, to stand down there still, under this sense of gravity, 22 meters of this thing hovering overhead, there's a certain kind of primitive feeling. And this is an 8-meter high clear glass, so there's a relationship between the city and a relationship down to the floor. When we were doing the competition, just before we submitted the drawings, we were a bit scared of doing a 22-meter cantilever, so we put in 2 columns. And then when we won the competition, we worked with this amazing Italian architect, and the first thing he did was took out the columns, and we went, thank God. And we said, why did you do that? He said, if I did that in Milan, everyone would laugh at me. So it was a brilliant kind of connection between what we wanted to achieve and the ability of the terrific Italian tradition of structural engineering. The other thing which we said earlier on in our lecture tonight is that light dissolves structure. So that even though every 25 meters there are these diaphragm walls, even though it is a very rational building, when light dances from different sections and different positions, it actually does dematerialize the structure. And this is somebody standing on one of the ledges, the reflection, the light coming through. If you have an opportunity that you're in Milan, please ask to enter, because the building feels very contained on the outside, but the feeling of light inside is really very different. And then the issue of materials. This is we use ceppo. We chose ceppo, which is what we call geological concrete. It's a beautiful stone on the outside, but as we went down, that 5 meters and that 9 meters, we were worried that light would not come with us. What is it like to bring light down 5 meters? What's it like to bring light down 9 meters? And we used this beautiful stone called Bianca Laza. And what's amazing about it is that some people have called it, it's like an oyster shell. It brings the light down deep into the space below, and really is the most elegant place for art. going down the 9 meters, there was a photographer who had permission from a person who lived next door, an elderly lady, who kindly allowed him to take photographs of the process of the building. Then when it opened on the 1st of November 2008, all of the citizens of Milan were allowed to enter the building. And the photographer said to us, would we like to go up and meet this woman? And we said, that'd be lovely. So Shelley and I went up to her apartment, and she was there with her family. We were introduced, and we said, would you like to see the building? She said, no. And then we stayed a while, and we talked to her family, and then as we were leaving, we said, would you like to see the building? No. And as we were going down the stairs, her daughter came running after and said she'd love to see the building. So we set off down with this elderly person, and we went into the 0, we went to the -5, and then we went to the -9. And she held my arm, and in Italian she said, the structure is immense, but it embraces you. Of course, when she said this, I started to cry. Because she had actually got our architectural ambition. And because it was an Italian family, there was absolute chaos, because the architect was crying, and what had the mother said? But it was an amazing experience, and I do think that us as a profession, architecture as a profession, speaks to people, and it speaks loudly, and sometimes we underestimate what we're saying, and sometimes things are saying too much, and sometimes they're saying nothing. So that's a very interesting discussion about architecture as a silent language, and what does it say, and what are we imposing on people?
The projects are not shown chronologically, and this is one of the most recent projects that we're working on, which is the Marshall Building in the London School of Economics. And we were talking about this today on the way over as to why it is so different from Bocconi, let's say. And I suppose the one thing leads to another is part of the story, but it's also the city that you find yourself in and the stage of work that one is at. And what we found about the task doing this competition was working in these dense streets. And what's lovely is the London School of Economics seems to exist on the streets because there's so little space and everybody spills onto the streets. And we felt that it was really important that we needed to clear out a space at ground floor. We needed to give something back to the city, or the university needed to give something back to the city. And also it's partly philanthropic. Paul Marshall is a philanthropist, and we were also interested in this idea of philanthropy and what a project can give back to the city. So the idea was to compress all of the uses that were needed and to make a space where the floor of the city could literally wash into the building. We also had a very large sports building on the lower ground floor, and then lecture halls, and then very small offices up above. So it's a very different kind of structure. Yvonne was on the top of the sketch, structuring space. We do try to think about a structure which in some way represents the hierarchy of spaces of the building. So we used what we called a transfer structure, which was needed to transfer from the bigger spaces down to a huge space in the basement. And that transfer structure became the architecture, you could say, of the building. So these were the ideas. And when we were asked to do the Venice Biennale, we were in the middle of this project. And part of the reason why we won was because we made this case that the university should give something back to the city, and that there should be a free space, that there needed to be what we thought of as a democratic space or an unprogrammed space where the unexpected could happen, that every university somehow sort of needed that. And that was partly, I suppose, the thesis of the Bocconi University as well. So we made this, the bottom image is what we call the transfer structure, which very often would be hidden below ground. And so we made these big trees, which have these big branches, and change the span from sports on the lower ground to medium-sized spaces up above to smaller spaces on the top levels. We're also situated in a very challenging location overlooking Lincoln's Inn Fields, 55-metre frontage onto Lincoln's Inn Fields, which again was something we really worried about and really thought about, and especially because we're across Lincoln's Inn Fields from the John Soane Museum, which is indeed sobering. And we thought about this building as being a kind of palazzo, and we worked a lot with the proportioning system and the Fibonacci and golden section to try and get a sense of proportion and a sense of a palazzo. Something that we think is really important as well in all the projects is no matter how dense a project is, that we would weave a sense of landscape into the mass of the building, which we've done at the upper levels. But just to go back to where projects come from, I suppose the Bocconi building was, and the Dublin building are quite rational, and this building is perhaps a change of direction, but it's partly to do with the bottom left-hand image, which was a space that we found, which is really tiny space on the other side of Lincoln's Inn Fields, and it's the undercroft of the Lincoln's Inn Chapel. And we just really loved that space because it's completely open, it has no door. There is a stair up to a chapel up above, but the stair leads up to the door at the top. And there was something kind of magical about no door, and making a space which had no door, and a stair that would disappear up into the sky, which you don't see in the bottom left image, but which does exist. And so that was the idea of our image, which is that we would make a stair which would lead up to the inner world of the university, but that it wouldn't be a defensive stair, that it wouldn't be about making this kind of space where the citizen didn't feel like he or she could enter. And just to continue the thing of structuring space, the middle image is the way that we converted this idea of moving from the big branches and the big structure to the smaller branches as you move up, that somehow that kind of forest of columns would express the uses that happen within. And we were also trying to do something, I suppose, which would express our interest in Vila Nova Artigas' fantastic structure in a bus station in Sao Paulo, where the image in the bottom right, he uses structure to bring light in. And just that whole idea of being able to use structure to bring light into space was something that was really important. And quite different to the Marshall Building in the London School of Economics is the Kingston University. It's called a townhouse building. And again, the idea here, it's the yellow site just over here, which is in a fairly nondescript road as you come out of Kingston, but it is close to Hampton Court and to those gardens. And it's a really advanced educational idea, where the idea was to make a building which was not in the ownership of any of the departments, that it would be shared between library space, quiet space, urban dance, performance, and it's a kind of mixture of things you would normally not expect to be together. And they talked about this thing of opening the university to the city. And so our response to this was to make an inside-out building in a way, where students could circulate on the edge, and that we would make a loggia or a colonnade. So while we're very interested in mass and walls and this ancient feeling of mass bearing down and being held up, that feeling that you get in historic buildings where you really get a sense of structure and weight and gravity, here we tried to make something which would feel much lighter and more porous and open. And again, this was very much related to the philosophy of the university. And it just happens that all of the projects, except two, which is the Department of Finance and the library, which we're going to show, they're all university buildings. And this happened by chance, that when we won the Bocconi project, we got on shortlists for other projects, for other competitions. But what we find is that each university is so completely different in terms of the philosophy that the university has. And we really try to work with the universities to try and take that as a basis as to how we can translate that into space. And we used the bottom right-hand image. It's a furniture showroom in Copenhagen by Utzon. But what we loved about it was that it really felt open and democratic and loose and has this kind of industrial feeling. And we felt that that was the kind of ethos that this university was looking for. And so we thought about this as being what we called a warehouse of ideas, where you could find, in the way that they wanted, you could find dance and libraries and lots of different kind of uses coexisting within this, again, quite rational structure. And in this case, one of the reasons why we won this competition was because we challenged the idea of the centre, which was to be a very large lecture theatre. And we felt that lecture theatres, having visited Alvar Aalto buildings, it's very hard to make lecture theatres without natural light after visiting Alvar Aalto. And we found that the thing of I know this is actually really like this building, but it doesn't have any windows, this lecture theatre, and it became the norm that lecture theatres would never have windows and would be enclosed boxes, and there's a reason for that. But we felt here that it should be more like a courtyard space, and that it should be it's treated as a kind of theatre space or a courtyard space, and all of the other spaces look into it. So you never miss an event. And I don't know if you have found this in your university, but I always remember the frustration of missing a really great lecture because I didn't know it was happening. But here we felt it was important that you would always feel what was happening in that space. And it's also designed to be used by students when there's for study or for sitting around, a casual kind of usage. And one of the things we learned about this competition and the post-competition experience is that the Royal Institute of British Architects kept on the jury who originally decided on the project. And that was really refreshing for us because even though you may not like it as students, the dreaded crit or the dreaded review, what you do actually miss that because nobody tells you honestly what they think when you're practicing architect. They tell you if they like something, but your colleagues, but they don't tell you if they, except for Izzy Metzstein, obviously, whom we obviously need to give us that kind of honest opinion. But what we found really interesting was the tussle of the jury and the university, and the jury kept saying, you know, this is not in the ownership, supporting us, saying this is not in the ownership of the drama school or the dance or whatever, and that it's a democratic space. And this jury used that term, democratic space, which we felt was really important to remember in the making of spaces. In the Institute Mean Telecom, it happens to be the same size as the Bocconi University, and it's on a greenfield site. A new campus outside of Paris. You can't actually see the Eiffel Tower from the site, which really disappointed us when we went to see it, because we felt, my God, we're going to make a building in Paris. And we kind of had the opposite to claustrophobia, it's agoraphobia, isn't it? When you're out in the middle of the countryside, and when we went to visit the site, there was virtually no building there, and it was really windy, and it's on a plateau, and we thought, my God, what are we going to do? Give us a city, give us a tiny, tight site and a city. And what we felt was, what was really important was to get the measure of making a university, a new university in an open space. And so we looked at monasteries and monastic plans, and we looked at the bottom left is Trinity College, and these are all to the same scale. And the top right image is Ospedale Maggiore in Milan, which is a most extraordinary building, which looks really simple, but it has the most wonderful connection of these different blocks with wonderful staircases, which are, in fact, protected from wind and rain, but external. And it's a marvelous building, which gave us the courage when we were working in Milan to make a wall, which was 180 meters long, and this is something like 220 meters long. So it's a fantastic project. So we found that the Institute Mean Telecom, which is our building here, was 2/3 of the Ospedale Maggiore. And we do this quite a lot, and we admit it, we take things from other projects and use them. So our project is literally this idea of compressing the university, the student component of the university, to make a more urbane or sociable kind of place within this countryside site, and to make a microclimate by making courtyards and gardens. And there was also a wonderful thing where we had to plant 100 trees, and we were intent on making ground which was real ground for real trees, so that a forest could grow over time, and that it was not, say, placed over a car park. And it's 200 meters long. It's very low budget. There's a lot of repetition. It's our second precast project. It'll be finished at the end of the year, and it's a very exciting thing to think about, to see how this kind of this monastic, as we think about it as being the university as a contemporary monastery. And we got a kind of, we gave a lecture in Paris, and we got a slightly cranky email from a French architect, I don't know who it was actually, saying, why don't you come out and declare your sources and say that you're influenced by La Tourette, that it's obvious in this project. And of course that was a fantastic compliment. And it wasn't that we weren't saying it, it's just that one is kind of hesitant about saying that something is like La Tourette, but it's very influenced by La Tourette as well. So, and then in Toulouse, which has been going on for quite a long time, we won this competition in 2010, and it was directly after we won the Bocconi competition. And we found this extraordinarily difficult because somehow we were more equipped to deal with the rational city, whatever our education was, let's say, and perhaps it's to do with the influence of Italy on our education, certainly. And when we went to Toulouse, which is this beautiful, it's called the Pink City, brick city. Originally it wasn't brick. Apparently it was a PR exercise for a mayor to strip all the buildings of the render so that they would have some identity, and it could be called the Pink City. So it's not as authentic as it sounds. But what we loved was the form of the city and the kind of broken heart quality of the city. And it's a really beautiful, picturesque city, very unlike Milan, which is this hard, rational city, which has its own magic. And one of the things we found was that we had to go back to a way of thinking about building in fragments, thinking about building in terms of how we might put together a collage of elements in order to make a construct. And we're situated right beside a medieval wall, which is this black line going from north to south. So there's a breach in a brick medieval wall, and we had to take our place in that breach in the wall. And part of our initial reaction was to kind of recede, but then we decided we would push the building right out to the edge and take our place beside this wall. And it's a completely eccentric shape, so it needed a very particular kind of way of dealing with the form. And in looking at the city, what we found were these beautiful, we were speaking about them today actually when we were in one of the Edinburgh courtyards. This is one of the Toulouse courtyards, they're really tiny, miniaturized. It's a Roman city, the old city, and we're at the junction of the old city and the new. And so this thing of the sky being the main aspect of these tiny courtyards was something we really wanted to use. And then there's the wonderful infrastructure of the bridges and the wonderful cathedrals and churches, which have all these buttresses and colonnades and cloisters and solidity. And again, one of the things that we found was that as in Kingston actually, which I didn't mention, is that, and because we know there's students in the audience, and we have to use the kind of stuff of architecture In other words, the problems, like in Kingston, what we found fantastic about having this idea of making external circulation is that it deals with fire escape. And fire escape are things that can really clog up a project and inhibit the fluidity of space. And we were struggling to find a way of making mass in this city because it's repetitive offices. So we made these 6 feet, which are fire stairs, and they make the solid brick buttresses, which we needed in order to make a building which would have presence to sit beside what is actually, we're right beside a beautiful Romanesque church. So we were trying to find a way also of dealing with the climate, because Toulouse is very hot in the summer. It's hotter than, well, it is hotter than Milan actually in the midsummer. And many of the courtyards that we went to visit, all the circulation was open, was protected from wind and rain. So we made the foyer space open to the environment, so you get the breeze of the city wafting through. And because of the way the Toulouse site and the way that the building was connecting with the city, unlike Milan, which is like a kind of outer crust, and that comes from Milan, because Milan is a city of walls. We wanted to make a kind of choreographed central space, which we used the spaces between lecture theatres to make huge windows where you could trap the city or views of the city and bring the sense of the city into the courtyard. And then what were the fire escape stairs that we describe make these buttresses, these 6 buttresses, one beside this Romanesque church on the right-hand side of the image. And we made the sky cloister, which traps a forecourt space. And again, when you move into that forecourt space, you frame the sky in the way that the Toulouse courtyards do. And we were beside this medieval wall, which is this beautiful brick wall with really thick, rough sand and cement joints. And the bricks we're using are not as orange as in this image. But we found a brick factory 1 hour from Toulouse who make bricks exactly the same size as the bricks in the medieval wall. And we were the first architects to use solid brick for something like 20 years, because architects in Toulouse, for whatever reason, were using brick slips. And we couldn't understand when we were shortlisted for the competition, and they kept saying to us, well, what kind of bricks are you using? And we said, well, bricks. And they said, well, what kind of bricks? And we kind of thought, well, a brick is a brick. And it's interesting, actually, the quarry from where the Ceppo comes in Milan is, again, 1 hour from Milan. And this factory that makes the bricks is 1 hour from Toulouse. And it was like going to a bakery shop. It was fantastic. They had circular biscuity bricks and square ones, and these ones were really useful because we had to meet the contemporary codes in terms of construction, and so we were able to combine concrete with brick in the making of columns and in the making of the colonnades and the sky cloister, which I just showed you. So I suppose what we've also learned how to, or tried to continue to learn how to deal with sometimes the very restricted scope that you have, how to open up enough scope to be able to make architecture. And we always find we're trying to work in the cracks, and we're always trying to resist the forces of the construction industry, let's say, or the forces of commerce, which pushes all of these prefabricated systems which have no heart and no quality, and just trying to find ways of making which would somehow give some sense of continuity in terms of architecture.
Neil talked about this project, which is UTEC in Lima in Peru. It was a competition that we weren't going to do. We decided for a number of reasons that we would. And to tell you the truth, we had no idea that we would win it. And when we won it, it was a big surprise because Lima is on the other side of the earth. And it has been an amazing experience. So we want to share it with you tonight, just the short story of this project. That the image, this image up here is the city of Lima. There are a number of desert cities in the world, and Lima is one of them. And it has, over 12 million people. It's right on the Pacific. It has this image on the right-hand side is 40-meter high cliffs that protect the city from the ocean. But because it is affected by the von Humboldt current, the temperature is kept roughly in the 20s all through the year. And it has a fog that comes and means that the city is shrouded in this incredible moisture, and it refracts light. That's one of the things we forgot to say. I forgot to say about Milan. Milan is also foggy, but what happens with fog is that it refracts light, and that light is actually more intense. But when we were Shelley and I had never been to Peru. One of our architects had been, and she told us stories about what life was like in Peru, what the people were like, what Lima particularly was like, how gregarious, how much of the life they live outside. And as we were listening to her, but also finding out about the von Humboldt current, we were ashamed to say, really, we knew very little about von Humboldt. And what is amazing about this man is that this drawing here, which is Naturgemälde, it's called it's an amazing drawing because it takes a section. This is a volcano in South America, but it was the first time where scientists up until that time, up until kind of von Humboldt's drawing, had all done their own bits of research and information separately, and had all the information, but always separately. And what he had done in this putting together was the first really environmental, a beautiful drawing in itself, but also it's linking temperature, height, pressure, vegetation. So it's really categorizing the Earth in the way that we now know it to be. This is a kind of blue planet, but earlier in terms of information. And this is, I mean, just in terms of the things we're trying to share with especially students of architecture, that architecture is really the physics of culture. So when we were in Dublin doing a competition for a city we didn't know, and these were the kind of physical properties that we thought about. In terms of the site, this top image is the Pacific. You're out at sea, hovering overhead. This is a valley, and up in the valley is the site. And these are kind of early drawings where the blue is representing the Pacific and the 40-meter cliffs. The site, which is a valley with a 360-meter long facade onto a very busy motorway, very long, thin, kind of like a banana or a boomerang kind of site. And the brief was for large laboratories, medium-sized laboratories, smaller laboratories, smaller ones. So we thought about it like a Russian doll, put the big things on the lower level and stack them, and then have the roofs of the lower laboratories to be, if you like, the gardens, the intimate gardens. And also this resonated with us. On the right-hand side is an image from Machu Picchu, this incredible Inca city high in the Andes, where they terraced the earth. So the section, this little drawing is really saying busy motorway. We'll stack the laboratories, and this discussion, if you like, of architecture as a new geography. That we have these inspiration, the cliffs, that we make a new university. This was the first time of this mining, engineering, and environmental research university. That this was the first time they were going to represent themselves. But previous to this, it was all second level, and now this was a new university expression of themselves. And when we looked at the work, and we talked about Lina Bobardi, but also Paulo Mendes de Rocha, we were interested in the kind of life of South America, the kind of bravery in terms of structuring space. And what's amazing in this soccer stadium, which he had built in section, the top drawing is a section, obviously, you know, we're very interested in soccer, let's say. That's the focus over there. But architecturally, what we found really impressive about this photograph is that the infrastructure of the stadium really was a place, the undercroft, the kind of shadow space, was the place where people would meet. And we asked the question, if we're building a university in a place where inside-outside is really quite similar in terms of temperature, could we not have, if you like, an arena for learning, a kind of a translate, could a university be a stadium for learning? Also, there's nice things about Lima, let's say, for an architect's point of view, it had 9 millimeters of rain, I think, maximum a year, so you didn't need any waterproofing, detailed bliss. No insulation was required because of the temperature, but it's highly seismic, so slight little bit of trouble. So this, what's really interesting was that we had done the section with the big going to small, and it's a bit like kind of bending your knees. It's really that actually is quite useful seismically, that you actually place those things. So this drawing on the right-hand side is describing the kind of seismic reaction that we would have a building that actually was hugging the ground and would step back. And also the sun does get through the fog, and the sun is at enormous intensity when it does. I mean, 12 degrees down from the equator, that's pretty hot. So what we were doing is that we had, on the section, you had this kind of peak cap, which was a way of controlling the sunshine and the sunlight as it entered into the section. So this was some of the competition drawings, the large section, the busy motorway, placing the car parking and the bigger public shared rooms down on the lower level, anchoring it, having the laboratories on view. I mean, Shelley was describing the educational ethos, say, in Kingston and in the London School of Economics. And here we were saying, if you have outside circulation and if you're studying various types of engineering, the viewing into the laboratories is something that you can share. You might be studying one type of engineering, but as you walk to different directions, you could view in. So these images here are really showing the outside, inside, and viewing into laboratories at this level. The fog is the other thing. This is an elevation during the competition, the busy motorway, the repeated structure, the air, if you like, full of fog, and as you're merging with the sky. And this model, which is showing the shoulder, the kind of architecture's new geography, shoulder to the motorway, and cascading terraces becoming the roofs of the laboratory. And we're sharing these two images with you this evening. When we were, Neil referred to the common ground, when David Chipperfield was the curator of the Venice Biennale, we had just won this competition in Lima, in Peru, and we made these study models and also paid homage to Mendes de Rocha. But these two images we had unfurled at about the same scale as you're seeing them here tonight. And the workmen in Italy said, why are you presenting two images of the same thing? And on the left-hand side is Machu Picchu, and on the right-hand side is Skellig Michel off the coast of Ireland. It's between 8th and 12th century monastery clinging onto these rocks in the Atlantic. And the issue for us is really, I mean, I think Neil referred to it as well, that if you like, we are so connected across the world. But what is amazing in the Inca city high up in the Andes, that there's nothing between the intimate terraces and the vast majesty of the Andes. And the same is true of the monks of Skellig Michel. There's the corbelled stone huts clinging onto these islands and their gardens, and then there's the vastness. There's nothing in between. So moving on to, we won the competition. We worked with local architects, shell architects, as site architects, and this is the section where embedded into the earth is the parking, and these guys here, these red little fellows, are the seismic isolators, and they're about this size, and they're the springs on which the building sits. We hope we never experience this, and we hope the engineers are really good So you have this embedded into the earth, the seismic isolators, and as you move up the building, you have these walkways which are open to the air, and then you have this little kind of peaked cap that protects you from the sun. And this is an image looking up through this, it's more like a carved mountain, and when Shelley and I went out, when we were taking down the scaffolding, as we walked through the space, it has, if you like, more presence than we had imagined it would be. And what is interesting is that because the site is curved, each of these, every 20 meters, you have these structures, but it's like a medieval, it's a bit like actually the beauty of this city here, because you can't quite see everything in plan. It's like a medieval city. You move through each of these and you're shifting. So these are the, you're looking up through the structure which is protecting you from the sun. You have reflected light within the interior, and you have woven gardens. So this is the shape of the structure. It is shifting because of the site, but it means that the vistas change. It's not a long. It's different to Bocconi in the sense that Bocconi is in the rational city of Milan, and this is responding to its context. And Shelley was describing the weaving of landscape into these are landscape pieces which are protecting the lusciousness of growth in these kind of countries is amazing, and you have the circulation. So you have students moving along and weaving through the project. And two things I suppose that are really important to us in terms of what work means. That when you build a building anywhere in the world, that each part of the world, whether it's Toulouse, whether it's London, whether it's Kingston, that each place is different. And students have to make, if you like, a kind of it's not quite a moral stance, but do you make buildings that could be anywhere in the world, or do you make buildings that are specific to place? And can you highlight the place? This image of the student at one of the circulation spaces where she's studying and looking out at the city of Lima, we hope to heighten your relationship and awareness of where you are. Like when you're in Toulouse, looking on that sky cloister, that you remember that the Garonne is in the distance, or that the Canal de Brienne is just close by. And then as you're a student walking on the external circulation, you're looking in at the laboratories, wondering what your colleagues are studying. So this is the building standing in the busy motorway. It has a shield for the motorway on the lower level. It has the canopy to protect to the sun, and you're starting to see the foothills of the Andes in the distance.
I should say that when we were doing this competition, it was in the middle of the recession in Ireland. I mean, all of these projects actually practically are products of competitions done outside of Ireland because of the recession. But there were two parts to the Lima brief. One was the practical thing of the spaces required, the fact that it's a vertical university. All of the stuff that goes with making a building. And we were practically finished this project, and I went on a flight somewhere and I took another part of the brief that Yvonne and I hadn't really bothered to look at, and that was the budget, the program, and what else was it? The contract. And I read those on the plane, and I thought I had the exchange rate wrong, and I thought they must be mad in relation to the program. And I got off the plane and said to Yvonne, have you read this part of the brief? And she said no. And it was too late to stop. We'd nearly finished. And then when we won, we found ourselves in Lima. Well, first of all, Yvonne was all enthusiastic on the phone, saying the people were wonderful. And I said, please ask them about the fees, and please ask them about the program and the budget. And she came back full of the joys of spring. And I said, did you mention money? No. So... And I mean, we're in practice 40 years, and is that stupidity or naivety or optimism? I don't know what it is. Anyway, we found ourselves back in February in a big boardroom, and we were saying, we don't know what to do. We didn't expect to win this competition. And now we're here, and we think the fees are impossible, and the construction period is too short, and the budget is too low. And they had their lawyers projecting the contract onto the wall. And that was the way the contract was negotiated. And our lawyer in Dublin said, "You're on your own here. I've never heard of this contract before." It was no standard contract. So we had to hold our nerve and just go through with it. And we could have been destroyed by that project because they're mining engineers and they have loads of money and they mine for gold. And if they wanted to come after us, they would have got us, you know. But they were fantastic people to work with, but it just shows maybe what optimism does. And we found it probably one of the most liberating experiences we've had, partly to do with the climate, and we just finished a building in the west of Ireland where the rain is so intense and the wind is so intense, and we couldn't believe that they didn't have waterproofing. That we had to deal with dust, humidity, and noise, and that was easy in comparison with the norm. So that's why it feels like a piece of infrastructure, like a football stadium or an aqueduct or a viaduct or something, because there are no windows on that side. I mean, the windows are just to the teaching rooms. Anyway, back to reality. In Dublin, post-recession, first project we've won in Dublin for, I don't know, 8 years or something, in Ireland for 8 years. And it's a fantastic project, which is the city, I'm going to use the mouse because this doesn't work so well for me. It's overlooking Parnell Square, and it is in this block. There's the Hugh Lane Gallery. Is this working, the mouse? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the site is behind this terrace of 5 Georgian houses, which are these here. So it's a hidden library, but it's part of the regeneration of this part of the city, which is hugely important. And when we were looking at this project, we looked a lot at Labrouste and read a lot about Labrouste, and it was amazing the way Labrouste talked about the library. And he was doing, I mean, his 2 libraries, one was on Place du Panthéon in Paris, the Sainte-Geneviève, and that was part of the regeneration of that part of Paris. So he was thinking about architecture and the regenerative quality of architecture, but he was also thinking about the library and said some really beautiful things about the healing quality of architecture. In fact, there's a really interesting quote which I have from him, where he's talking, this is in 1832, and he said, "The more I see this sick world, the more I feel the time coming when this world will throw itself into the doctor's arms, and that doctor is the artist. The artist is the only one in our day who can heal humanity of an ailment which has been unknown until now. The artist is the only one who can give the heart its heat back, and the heart is what is sick today, and the soul is dry." And that's 1832, and we're still on about that, let's say, about the soul being dry or the heart being sick, and how we think about culture and about architecture, I suppose, is probably one of the biggest challenges that we find as architects, is the status of culture, or the lack of status of culture and architecture in contemporary society. And what we found fantastic about dealing with the library, the image above is a little sketch we made about integrating landscape with the building, and also because the history of Parnell Square was as a pleasure garden, which is no longer as beautiful as it used to be. And this is our terrace of houses. And behind that, we've made a space at the scale of the City Hall in Dublin, which is the closest thing we have to a kind of piazza which feels external, and it was once external, the City Hall in Dublin. It was a stock exchange and it was open to the city. And so we wanted to make a space which would have this scale and would, because it's embedded in an urban block, would have this sense of zenithal light. And we raised all of the accommodation above the height of the rooms of the houses, so that when these houses are looking into the space, they're not looking directly at another building, they're looking into a space. And we've woven landscape up through the building, and made this, trying to reinstate this idea of the pleasure garden within the building, and that would penetrate through to the thinking about how the quarter would be regenerated. And again, it's one of the things we thought about when we were doing the Venice Biennale, is this idea of democratic space. And the library is really the only democratic institution left in our society, in the sense that there's no control, there is control of books and control of resources, but anybody can enter. What's inside is given unconditionally by these very open, inspired and inspiring people, the librarians, and it is a fantastic institution, and it's something that we've really enjoyed working on, as maybe a contrast to many other projects, which is about control and resisting of perhaps free entry of the citizen into public space. So these are the kind of spaces we're making within the block, as a release of the space, but as a contrast with the fantastic reading rooms, which will look south over the city, which will be housed in the brick crust, and then that we would make this public space full of light, which would lead up through the gardens and up to the roof. And we've placed the conference and lecture theatre at the top level, partly to do with noise, but also to bring people up to the roof terrace. And this is a little tiny garden that you experience as you move up through the staircases, and you end on a terrace, which is a flat roof where some of the pitched roofs have been removed, and we've kept that flat roof as a way of making a public space overlooking the city. And then the thing that's really important is the way that the public space will be calmed and civilized, because at the moment it's full of cars and full of traffic. And this was once called Palace Row, and it's at a really high point in the city facing south, and so it's potentially a fantastic public space. And then when we came to doing Venice, the Biennale, when we were invited, and Yvonne spoke earlier about the thing of having to write a manifesto. And what we were asked to do was to make a Biennale which would in some way reflect our values, which we found, again, quite a challenge. And we remembered Paulo Mendes de Rocha's description of Venice when we were studying his work in 2012, that he called it the capital of the imagined world, which we thought was a fantastic way of describing this amazing city. And Yvonne spoke about the thing of free space and using that as a guideline, and the importance of free and the importance of space. And in the logo, we had as many different languages as the participants, and these were used in their original language to, I suppose, make the point about language and translation of language and the importance of translation in architecture as well as in literature and in language. But the kind of values that we thought about, again, Yvonne mentioned the thing of generosity, but we also talked about architecture having the responsibility to express the unspoken wishes of strangers, the sense of humanity that's at the core of architecture, as well as the sense of generosity, the thing of resources and the fact that the earth, we thought about the earth as client, and that in this time that we really have to shift our thinking in terms of how we act as consumers, both as architects, that we consume materials in a way which isn't often respectful, and which kills materials rather than bringing them to life, that we simply consume and use and don't often treat materials with care, and how important these resources are. And what we found as an experience, it was like a huge piece of research. And we found that there were so many architects who worked at so many different scales, and especially architects who worked with very little opportunity. Like, for instance, there was an architect from Mexico, Rosana Montiel, doing things like water treatment plants or water towers or water collection, working with communities who have nothing, let's say. And she was making the case for the combination of beauty as with infrastructural projects. And she told us at one of our meetings on architecture that one community said to her, she said, we have to make it beautiful. And they said, but do we deserve beauty? And we just thought that was such a kind of reflection on our society. And actually, it reminds me of when we were invited to do this talk, we went back over the Gillespie Kidd and Koya book that we have and read pieces. I mean, first of all, it renewed our respect for the incredible strength of that work of Izzy Metzstein, Andy Macmillan within that practice. But there was a quote that we thought was really interesting. Actually, I think it was the piece I'm reading from was written by Gordon Benson, but I'm not sure. But he says it was common enough practice for architects during that period to operate in a type of anonymity. Architects involved in the social program, as Metzstein called it, were often dedicated to social aims and objectives, to the remaking of a society of equal opportunities for all, and thus to lay claim to an individual artistic vision and accomplishment may have seemed at best to go against the grain of such a program, and at worst hypocritical and elitist. And what's really interesting about that piece is that it touches on, in a way, what we feel is absent from a lot of contemporary architecture, which is the humanistic agenda. And it was something we really wanted to bring out in the Biennale. But it also touches on the way that architecture is practiced now, which is very much to do with the individual or the name or the reputation of one person, and is not always to do with the democratic, open, atelier-type atmosphere, which allows young and old and new and old architects to develop and thrive within that atelier situation. And so it reminded us of this, as well as bringing us back to that fantastic body of work. But this was really something that was embedded in the agenda of the Biennale. And Yvonne said it wasn't full of stars, but I mean, there were some stars, but we didn't go to find people with reputations. We went to find people with reputations whose work we really, really respected and had affected us. But we also wanted to find people in the cracks, because that's the way we've developed, in the cracks between the systems, so to speak. And that to find people who were making work at very small scale and at a large scale, work that has really changed our way of thinking about architecture, or reinforced our way of thinking about architecture. And I suppose one of the things that has come across when dealing with architects from Indonesia and Mexico and Vietnam and parts of the world, and China, parts of the world where we didn't know this work. And we spent 6 months researching this kind of work and making new discoveries. And these two images just describe, I suppose, the stage that we know we're all at in terms of our responsibility as architects. This top film, Chasing Ice, we had a little film program in a room where people could rest. And one of them was to do with this thing of chasing ice and the whole phenomenon of the climate change and the melting ice. And one of the projects in the Biennale was a Danish architect, Dorte Mandrup, where she presented a building in Greenland and found that they used to not need foundations for buildings in that icy place because the ice was stable. And now they find that they have to think differently about how to build on the ice because the ice is melting and becoming unstable. And then the thing of carving stone, the Carrara Marble, this wonderful film made by a young architect actually called Il Capo, the boss, and how we're digging out of the earth and how we need to think really seriously about how we use resources and why, and arm ourselves with enough knowledge to be able to make responsible decisions. And there's this maybe minimal expression of space, let's say, is by Marina Tabassum from Bangladesh. And she makes buildings in Bangladesh, but she also works with communities in isolated places, and she works with the making of houses for $2,000, and works very closely with people who need support. But here she makes a fantastic, we thought it was a really beautiful, very poetic piece where she made the enclosure. The architectural intervention is made with wire, so it's an implied enclosure. So it's like a Calder drawing, but the way she describes it is wanting to make the minimum, I can't remember exactly, it was the minimum intervention, minimally intrusive, to maximize the impact of architecture. So on the one hand, we at times as architects need to make very strong architectural statements, but sometimes we need to stand back and facilitate people in the improving of their lives. And this was something we found really inspiring and as I say, a huge piece of research. And maybe to pick up on the quote about the social program, one of the interpretations of free space which we really liked, made by Elizabeth Hatz, the Swedish architect who made a fantastic room which was full of the history of drawings. And her interpretation of free space was that free space is not necessarily clean, and it is often conquered. For architectural projects, this means expanding the interpretation of the brief beyond the prescribed and immediate client into a wider collective of unknown users. It's a hidden contract with the outcast, the most vulnerable, those who have no say. It carries by necessity a clandestine element of generosity and unlikely dignity. And I suppose that's the kind of point we were trying to make or to search in the compilation of the choices that we made in the Free Space Biennale. And the last image is the Earth as Client, which I suppose is the next phase of all of our lives as architects. Many have been practicing it already, but we feel that there's an urgency in terms of really seriously thinking about how we shift our mindset and how we shift the mindset of society to, in a way which would bring out a better society where consumerism is less powerful, let's say, and where we can imagine another kind of set of values, hopefully, which would not just think about resources in terms of materials, but also in terms of communities and in terms of people and in terms of this whole thing of the humanity and the need for architecture to express its position in terms of humanism and humanity. Thank you.
Shelley, thank you so much for tonight. 4 hours ago I had no role in tonight at all, but I mentioned to Neil that I was taking a back seat, and that was the stupid thing to say, because Neil said, you can do the questions and answers. So I am your ringmaster tonight for questions and answers. It is a discourse which implies backwards and forwards with ideas. While you're all thinking of erudite questions, and somebody is going to be with a microphone, I'm not sure who that person is, a couple of things, a silly thing and a serious thing about Dublin and Izzy Metzstein and Andy McMillan. They were part of a thing called the Flying Circus, going backwards and forwards to UCD when it was particularly low time to cheer up the school. And Murray Grigger reminded me of this story where the students were doing an airport terminal at Knock, which was a recent project in Ireland, and the first student explained the scheme, and the idea was that people would fly from Knock to Lourdes and back. You get 2 shrines for the price of 1 Ryanair. And the first student explained that brief, and Izzy, not being very interested in political correctness, said at the end of this, "I assume, therefore, there will be no disabled facilities in the arrival lounge." Quite amusing. Anyhow, the serious point I wanted to make actually was what was extraordinary about your presentation to me, thinking about Izzy's work actually, was how you described everything as architectural space. And that's how Izzy describes space, the buildings being agglomerations and organization of spaces, as indeed are cities. But the other thing I thought was quite extraordinary actually was every time you showed us a new project, you started with a section, almost invariably, and you describe your buildings primarily as a section, and you think of Izzy and Andy's buildings, and it's almost impossible to even begin to describe any of their buildings without instantly sketching out some of the remarkable sections that generated their buildings there. So I thought there was an amazing connection between your work and their work, which is very appropriate, I think. Incidentally, this is actually the 2018 discourse, by the way, just in case you were wondering. We had some sort of cock-ups in the autumn, so I'm hoping there will be another one this year to make up. Anyhow, now I've rabbited on, and I'm looking out at the first person who's going to ask an erudite question and start our discourse going. Hands up. Professor Webster.
I don't know if it's erudite. I just wondered, where did you work between university and setting up your own? Did you set up immediately after university? Or?
Well, yeah, there were 5 of us when we set up. Cleary, Farrell, Hall, McNamara and Murphy, and we thought that was too long, so we called ourselves Grafton Architects. So 2 worked in Paris, 2 in London, and 1 in Seville. So Yvonne worked with Cross, Dixon, Gold, Jones and Sansom, Edward Jones and Christopher Cross, who were our teachers. I worked with a student of Ed Jones, whose name I can't remember, a Swiss architect. Our other 2 colleagues worked with Candilis, Jessica Woods and Marcel Breuer. And Frank Hall worked in Seville with people not Bach and Mora, but a kind of offspring of Bach and Mora.
But what's interesting about your question is that we worked for a short time and then came back to Ireland with the kind of audacity of youth, kind of setting up and wanting to work in a certain kind of way, and the offices we felt we couldn't work in certain places. And I think there's a kind of an innocence, when you think of setting up fairly early on. So we began, and I think looking back, Shelley was making the point earlier on today that there's a kind of an implied thing that you work with certain offices and then you suddenly there's a kind of a birth of something else, but that maybe the layering of kind of collectives where things are much more subtle, it's more studio based, means that you've got the overlap of a number of generations working together. That's a more benign situation. It don't have to spawn off. It doesn't always have to fracture. So we set up very early on in the kind of naivety of youth, let us say, but and then projects, if you like, were the experience.
We set up 1 year after finishing college. We knew nothing, and thankfully the man, Frank Hall, who'd worked in Seville, knew something about building. Otherwise we would have been in trouble. We were full of passion, energy, enthusiasm. We were given jobs as teachers in the School of Architecture in UCD by a very generous head of school, and that was important. And I think that's one of the reasons why the culture of architecture has developed in Dublin, because the universities were quite open and young people could come and teach and have conversations with each other and have conversations with older architects. So the schools are very important, I think, in the generation of a culture of architecture.
Also, I mean, it's a two-way thing between practicing architecture and being, if you like, having discussions with students. It's a two-way thing in terms of experience and doubt. Alejandro de la Sota also talks about doubt, you know, that everyone has doubt in terms of design or in making, but then one has more experience. I think also we are enriched by our colleagues, you know, that other people who are teaching, who are practicing architecture, enrich our lives, so that the relationship between, we have always taught, and I think it's both an intellectual and economic. I mean, the architectural practice is so, it varies so much with the economy, that there's also an intellectual kind of stability and a financial benefit to being part of an institution that has a consistent support for architecture as an optimistic profession, that it's really dealing with the future. I mean, the practice of architecture is a difficult profession, and it wanes and wanes. It's either too busy or too little. It's a phenomenon that you need to have a certain, if you like, overview to survive.
Difficult to be optimistic sometimes. Question in the middle.
Hello, this is Iram Serafoglu. I'm a structural engineer and architect, and I'm doing a PhD in architecture here. Can you hear me? Yes. I have a question about the structures of your designs, and the structures are very aesthetic and very well illustrated in the design. It's a very, very, very good part of your design. What is your criteria in choosing the structural engineer that you're working in each project? Are you using the same structural engineer, or is it different for every project, and what's your criteria? Thank you.
We use different structural engineers. The criterion for our structure is, well, actually something that kind of changed our attitude to structure is about, I don't know, it must be 20 years ago, an Irish engineer asked us to work with them on the design of bridges. And we'd never found that a column you couldn't put your arms around, just standing at the base of a bridge and seeing structure of that scale. We somehow discovered the liberating quality of large-scale structures, and working with those engineers was very beneficial for us in thinking about structure. But our approach to structure is kind of pragmatic. You probably would see, like, the Toulouse structure is very pragmatic. So sometimes it's pure and everything makes sense, and sometimes it's less pure. But I suppose what we do believe is that the structure is the skeleton of the body, and that it's primary. It's not secondary. It's primary. And the work that has influenced us, the Villanova Artigas, the Lina Bobardi, the Izzy Metzstein, Addie Macmillan, you can always see the structure. So, and the more evident it is, the stronger it is spatially and architecturally. And that's something that we really feel very strongly about.
I think that there is a big issue in the history of architectural education when engineering and architecture split. And I think that architecture suffers, and I think engineering, I think engineers, if there's none in the audience, but I think that many engineers do not use their kind of imagination in the same way as they could have been. Shelley's describing some of the South American architects which kind of push things to their limit. But it's a kind of a sad tale when architecture and engineering kind of uncoupled, and then architecture can become just the wrapping of a kind of a chocolate box at one level, or that engineering then becomes, you know, so kind of elemental that it has lost a kind of dignity. And I remember conversations with Shelley's describing in terms of the bridges. One of the early conversations was the engineers were also discovering that through architectural conversations that the structure was becoming more and more elegant and more efficient, so that we lose that conversation between structural engineers and architects. It's sad that there aren't more intimate kind of structural architectural conversations.
Well, I disagree with you. I hope there are structural engineers here tonight who might learn something there. Next question. And any more hands going up? Can I ask a question? I remember Ted Cullinan saying to me a story that Peter Smithson told his first-year students at the Architectural Association, that they would be very lucky if they ever had an original idea. And you said you take things frequently. Have you had an original idea? I see that as a virtue, not having original ideas, incidentally.
I don't think there is such a thing, actually.
Cult of originality.
I think what's important, though, especially in relation to students, is finding your own personality and your own judgment as to what to take and how to put it together. And judgment and being able to see and know what's relevant is that brings about sometimes a certain kind of originality. It's a bit like translators or something. You get good translations and bad translations, and it's like you're either a good translator or you're not. And good translation demands a lot of imagination, and there's a lovely word in Italian which is tradurre and tradurre is betrayal, and tradurre is translation. So there's a betrayal process involved in translation. So one of the essays we love is Tradition and the Individual Talent, written by T.S. Eliot, and he makes that case that the role of the poet is about the continuation of an existing tradition, not about the personality of the poet.
I think imagination is free. I think that we are human beings in a beautiful world. We can choose not necessarily to replicate, but be influenced by. And sometimes it's the standing under a beautiful cherry tree in springtime, and you say, wouldn't it be amazing to make a building that had this beauty? And people stand in a forest, and it's just the dapple light. I mean, I think that everything is informing architects, and that I think when you say is any original idea, I think that each project is if you like, a collage of not just a number of ideas, but a collection of people and the industry to make. So it's a collage. You need someone with experience to be able to build it. You need a good carpenter. You need somebody to make the plaster, that beautiful Venetian plaster in your house. That's magic to put your hand on that surface. You needed somebody to translate it, and that was taken from, and that collage is taken from somewhere else. So it's not a vacuum. We're not building on the moon at the moment, but so you build on the earth with earthly materials, and you take dimensions and things that are that you see to be good.
That was a deliberately provocative question, which I hope you all agree provoked two absolutely amazing answers. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Joyce now to give the vote of thanks, and I personally, it's been a wonderful evening.
Been totally awestruck tonight. I think it's been an absolutely fabulous and illuminating insight into all that you do. So thank you very much. Before I come back to you, so please don't disappear, I would like to propose several votes of thanks, which you have to do after an organising something like this. We're very grateful to Ian Gilzine, Chief Architect, and Sandy Robinson, Principal Architect of the Scottish Government, for their continued financial support and their commitment to the discourse. We also thank Fiona McLachlan, Professor of Architecture of Practice, Edinburgh University, for their cooperation and for the use of the lecture theatre tonight. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Neil Gillespie for his efforts in arranging this whole event and the publication. Thanks also go to Colin Greenslade, Director of the RSA, and Matt Hill of the RSA for their invaluable assistance and patience during the organisation of this important event. And what was initially a kind of minestrone, and as time went on, it became a clear, crystal clear consomme, which those of you who follow MasterChef will know is the kind of height of culinary skill. Finally, back to the most important people in the room, Yvonne and Shelley. There's been a great insight into your work, and we can't thank you enough for giving up your time to come and talk to us. I'm sure that for many of the students present, this has been totally inspirational and aspirational. And so on behalf of the Royal Scottish Academy, I'd like to present you both with the Royal Scottish Academy Metzstein Medal for Architecture. So.